Viva la quinta brigada, rumba la rumba la rumba la. Viva la quinta brigada, rumba la rumba la rumba la.
They were the first Americans to take up arms against fascism, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. They have been called the conscience of the 30s.
They were all volunteers. They all served without pay, or for practical purposes, no pay. They all paid very heavily for their commitment, and over half of them lie buried in Spanish soil.
The Spanish Civil War has been called the last great cause. Ernest Hemingway romanticized it in For Whom the Bell Tolls. Writers George Orwell, Andre Malraux, John Dos Passos added their testimony for the Republican cause. The brutality of the war and the terrible new weapons destroyed the idealism. There were atrocities on both sides, and the cynical manipulation of Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin muddied the issues. To some, it was a war involving democracy, fascism, and communism, all three. To the Catholic Church, it was a war against godless, atheistic communism. To liberal intellectuals, it was a last chance to stop fascism. The war polarized both left-wing and right-wing thought and revealed the self-delusions of passionately held ideologies. The marks of civil war still scar the landscape of Spain, a land of stark contrasts and harsh realities, the country that inspired Cervantes, Goya, and the Inquisition. For a millennium, Spain was held tightly in the grip of the Catholic Church, a church so powerful and wealthy that it was a state within a state. The Catholic Church, the army, the landed aristocracy, and the monarchy ruled absolute. Spain's royal family, King Alfonso XIII and Queen Victoria Eugenie, they had lost the support of the people. In 1931, they fled Spain. They left behind a country bitterly divided, half illiterate, and poor. February 1936, the last democratic elections to be held in Spain for 40 years. The Popular Front, a coalition of the left, defeated the conservative National Front. Spain now had a working democratic government for the first time. Left pitted against right, a familiar form of street violence rocked Spain. On the right, the Phalangists, or fascists, intensified their terrorism. In June, Calvo Sotelo, leader of the monarchists, threatened the government. If the fascist state means no more strikes, no more disorder, he said, I am proud to declare myself a fascist. July 12th, Calvo Sotelo was assassinated. The rebellion now had its martyr. From Morocco, General Francisco Franco became the spokesman of the revolt. He declared that a state of war existed. The aristocracy and the church called upon the armies of Franco to restore the glory of Spain with a cross and the sword. The Spanish Civil War was underway. It was a holy war and a class war. The war quickly became a bloodletting. On the Loyalist side, in the first 3 months, frenzied mobs turned on their oppressors, the landowners, and the clergy. Hundreds of priests and nuns were murdered. On the Franco side, terrorism was a calculated military policy to control the local populace. American newsreels could not convey the grief and the horror of this war.
I have seen war on land and sea. I have seen blood running from the wounded. I have seen the agony of mothers and wives. I hate war.
FDR called for a moral embargo on trade with either side in Spain. Mussolini openly announced his support of Franco. Il Duce, fresh from his Ethiopian victory, sent 70,000 troops to Spain, as well as tanks, artillery, and planes. Hitler, buoyed overjoyed by his success in the Rhineland, sent his elite Condor Legion, bombers and fighters of Germany's new Luftwaffe, anxious to taste combat. 6,000 specialized troops, artillery, tanks, and advisors. The pretext was to crush communism in Spain. The Republican government undertook the overwhelming task of creating a people's army. They were high on enthusiasm and courage, but short on training, discipline, and weapons. The Loyalists' loud slogans and stirring songs smothered the ominous silence from Britain and France. The duly elected Republican government of Spain could not even turn to its democratic neighbors to buy critically needed weapons. The Loyalists were isolated and alone. Conservative French and British politicians and diplomats preferred Franco's discipline and order to Loyalist liberalism and radicalism. They were afraid of antagonizing Germany and Italy and pushed through the policy of non-intervention. It amounted to appeasement. The Anglo-French strategy was to contain the war in Spain. France closed its borders and sealed off Spain. The policy of non-intervention, prohibiting aid to either side in Spain, became official. The Non-Intervention Committee met in London and soon became a mockery. Germany, Italy, and Britain kept it bogged down in procedural disputes and red tape. America never joined. The United States profiteers rushed to ship arms to Spain before the new arms embargo law went into effect. A race was on. One company, Vimalert of Jersey City, shipped nearly $3 million worth of aircraft engines to the Loyalists. The cargo arrived dockside in time to beat the arms embargo by 1 day. The last pictures of the ship were taken in Hoboken Harbor. The Mar Cantabrico was intercepted by Franco forces who captured the military equipment and executed the Spaniards among the crew. Texaco sold oil to Franco on credit during the war, and a DuPont subsidiary supplied Franco with bombs. Stalin was cautious about intervention in Spain. Because of the neutrality violations of Italy and Germany, Russia finally sent tanks, planes, and advisors, but no infantry.
The Spanish Civil War, for some curious reason, was a tremendously emotional cause with all of Western liberalism and left-wing opinion. More than anything in this century, it seems to me. There was huge enthusiasm and people were fired up. And I think Stalin, I suspect that he was afraid that the Russians would become imbued with this same spirit and would become too close to non-communist socialist circles in the rest of the world. I suspect this was very strongly in his mind.
From all over the world, 40,000 volunteers organized by the Communist International came to fight for the Spanish Republic. They were called the International Brigades. And among them, more than 3,000 Americans, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. A civilian army of liberals, socialists, and idealists who years later would all be branded as communists. Though largely recruited by the Communist Party, their goal was not revolution.
Si me quieres escribir, ya sabes mi paradero. Si me quieres escribir, ya sabes mi paradero.
When I first heard about the Spanish Civil War, I sort of sympathized with the Republican or the Loyalist side, but it didn't enter my head to go to fight. But before too long, it became apparent that Hitler and Mussolini had joined that war on the side of Franco, and that it was no longer a question of a simple civil war between Spaniards. Hitler was the epitome of all the things I'd been fighting against all my life. And to become involved in Spain was just another step in the direction which my life had been going. Our biggest problem was the fact that we didn't have sufficient equipment to do our job. On 4 different occasions, the Lincoln Brigade was involved in combat where we had the fascists on the run. And in each case, the assault failed because we simply ran out of ammunition, supplies, and food and water.
I was exploring, learning, discovering, experimenting, and I had joined the Communist Party. I didn't take it very seriously. I joined because it was active in labor organization, fighting racial discrimination, fighting fascism, fighting war, and there didn't seem to be anybody else doing much of that. The Democrats certainly weren't, and the Republicans certainly weren't, and the Socialists weren't very effective. The Communist Party was very active and visible at that particular time. And I signed a party application card, and I had never read Das Kapital or State and Revolution or knew that there was such a thing as dialectical materialism. And yet, I guess I could be technically identified as a communist, but ideologically, I was still a Boy Scout.
In 1936, the Communist Party joined forces with socialists and liberals to oppose fascism. The official policy conceived in Moscow was called the Popular Front.
The party was not preaching revolution in 1936 or 1937. It was preaching opposition to fascism. And the main place that opposition to fascism was taking place in those days, the battle lines were in Spain.
In February 1937, the Americans saw their first action in the bloody Battle of Jarama. 40,000 fascist troops, led by tanks and supported by artillery and German aircraft, attempted to cut off the last remaining road out of Madrid.
Viva la quinta brigada, viva la quinta brigada,
The young, green, and poorly equipped Americans were thrown into the counterattack. It was a suicidal mission against overwhelming firepower. 450 Americans went into the Battle of Jarama. 300 were killed or wounded. One brigadier described the horror in poetry. Death stalked the olive trees, picking his men. His leaden finger beckoned again and again. In spite of appallingly high casualties, the Lincolns served in every major campaign of the war. Ernest Hemingway said of them, "They fought as well as American fighting men have fought anywhere." In November 36, the Franco forces unveiled a new tactic, terror bombing of civilians. Madrid became the first major European city to experience a blitzkrieg. Hemingway called it mechanized doom. New York Times correspondent Herbert Matthews described the horror. "It is a terrible moment," he said, "when one can hear a bomber directly overhead, knowing its power of destruction and feeling so helpless." It's rather strange that Hitler never learned from this that bombs may break the bodies but not destroy the spirit of the people. In April 37, the German Condor Legion bombed the Basque town of Guernica, later to be immortalized in Picasso's famous painting. Guernica crystallized American public opinion. Even conservative Life magazine described members of the Lincoln Brigade as American fighters against fascism. Political youth of Europe and America cried over Spain, rejoiced, got drunk, fell in and out of love over Spain. In Midwest American villages, families split over Spain. It felt like personal conscience on trial. On a Paris street, I met a young friend, Jimmy Lardner, the son of Ring. We will all have to meet this thing somewhere, he said. I just decided to meet it there. He was one of the very last American volunteers to die there. Before Guernica, most Americans were unconcerned about the war in Spain. After the bombing, there was a public outcry against the deliberate slaughter of civilians. In February '38, 3/4 of those expressing an opinion favored the Loyalists. Claude Bowers, the American ambassador to Spain, passionately pro-Loyalist, urged repeal of the arms embargo. But Secretary of State Howell repeatedly ignored Bowers, and as late as May of '37, said there is no evidence of German and Italian military forces in Spain. As President Roosevelt left for a fishing vacation, he was a man in a dilemma. His sympathies were with the Loyalists, but he held back for political reasons.
President Roosevelt was much more interested about domestic issues, and part of the New Deal coalition was based on the Catholic support in the large cities of the East, and the Catholic support was on the Franco side in the war. So to support the Loyalists would have been to lose some of his political support and perhaps lose the momentum of the New Deal.
While the Catholic Church hierarchy saw the Spanish conflict as a holy war against communist atheism, 1/3 of the Catholic laity were pro-Loyalist.
We hoped, rather naively it turned out, that our conduct would so arouse the passion of the American people as to perhaps bring about a change in American policy. Imagine the cruel and painful paradox of being an American soldier fighting against fascism and not being able to carry an American gun.
By the summer of '38, the international brigades were demoralized and near exhaustion. While Germany sharply increased weapons shipments, Russian arms were dwindling. For political reasons, Stalin began pulling back from Spain. After the Munich crisis in '38, Russia stopped supplying arms and advisors to the Loyalists, and the Spanish government sent the international brigades home in an effort to persuade the League of Nations to order Franco's German and Italian troops to leave. As the brigades left, heralded in a final parade through Barcelona, they were saluted. You can go proudly. You are history. You are legend. What name do we give men who fought for a cause in which they believed, hero or villain? In their lifetime, the brigadesmen would carry both labels and a precious memory.
I was very young. I was witness to what I experienced as one of the most glorious pages in human history. Here was a people, almost a whole people, practically alone. They were withstanding the onslaught of world fascism at that time. They had been abandoned by their sister democracies, England and France and our own country. Nevertheless, they resisted, not just for Spain, but for all of us, for 3 years. They paid an enormous price, and the glory, and that's the best word I can choose, that was the Spanish people at that time, still shines for me. And their defeat, that enormous tragedy, a tragedy for all of us, still is an active wound in my heart.
The great exodus began. They numbered 300,000, those who fled to the frontier. In the clenched hands of some, a fistful of Spanish earth. Far away in Washington, President Roosevelt admitted that American policy had been a grave mistake. The Spanish Civil War was a grim tragedy, not only on the battlefields in Spain, but in the diplomatic chambers in France, Britain, and the United States. The world showed Hitler and Mussolini that it was soft, and the dangerous policy of appeasement was born in the Spanish Civil War. Hitler and Mussolini knew that Britain, France, and the U.S. were not ready for war and would do anything to avoid it. While European powers used the Spanish War to test their weapons, the United States used it to test its ability to avoid war. French, British, and American neutrality helped assure that the cause for which most volunteers fought would lose.
Democracy in Spain was dead. Franco's dictatorship would last 35 years. Berlin, June 1939. Adolf Hitler decorated the Condor Legion for its valor in Spain. For the first time, he publicly acknowledged their role in that war. 3 months later, they would be in Poland. 1 year later, in Paris.